So Kim, tell us what's on your radar.
Over the weekend, America watched in horror as the Taliban swiftly took over Afghanistan. A process that should have lasted at least a month took the Taliban only days. Many are now watching the news in fear over what will happen to the women and girls who now have to live under this Islamic regime. We remember the Taliban from before 2001, a fundamentalist extremist group who forbade girls from having an education and women from holding jobs. Images haunt us of women accused of adultery being publicly stoned and stories of executions. Women couldn't be seen in public without a male escort and really couldn't be seen at all under their full head-to-toe coverings. But the Taliban say they have changed. The organization is filled with a younger generation and claims to be more open to different ways of life. The Taliban spokesperson, Sahal Shaheen, made a surprise live call into a BBC program yesterday to discuss the future of Afghanistan under the new laws. When asked whether or not girls will be able to attend school and if women can have jobs, this is what he says is the official policy of the Taliban.
There are hundreds of schools for girls, universities there where the girls students are studying. There is no restriction on them. They are continuing their studies and they are going to schools they were going in the past. So
in Herat, for example, women are telling me that when they arrived at the gates of their university yesterday, Taliban fighters told them to leave and that there would be instructions from Quetta Shura about whether they could attend university or not. That is what the fighters on the ground are telling the women of Herat.
No, what I'm telling is the policy. The policy is that women can have access to education and to work. And of course, they will observe the hijab. That's it.
Foreign Policy magazine corroborates this. In May of 2020, FP reported on girls' schools and villages being supported and encouraged by the Taliban, even being attended by many of the Taliban's own daughters and sisters. Now, what level of education is unknown. There are reports of young women being turned away from university these past few days, but it's unclear if that will be permanent or just until a transition of power. Islamic law states women are entitled to the same education as men, and Shaheen makes it clear the Taliban intend to rule Afghanistan under Islamic laws. When asked if women will have to wear a niqab that covers their entire face, Shaheen says women will have to wear hijabs, of which there are many types. When asked if women will have to have male escorts, he says no, and actually claims that was a misnomer. That was never even a thing back in the 90s. When asked about executions and harsh punishments for committing crimes, he does say the country will abide by Islamic laws. Many of those punishments do seem very barbaric to those of us here in the West, and it doesn't sound like those are going to change. But here's what's also really interesting about what's happened in these past few days. The Taliban were able to swiftly take over the country because there wasn't any real resistance. Western media claims that people were just too frightened to fight back without the support of U.S. troops, but the reality is a bit more complicated than that. The Taliban are Afghans. U.S. troops are not. The puppet government the U.S. was propping up was riddled with corruption. The installed government wasn't opposing the Taliban out of some ideology of liberalizing Afghanistan. They were doing it for money. The Afghan people knew this. They were fed up with their country being occupied by Western foreigners propping up a corrupt crony government. And as a result, many of them began to support the Taliban, join the Taliban, or in the least were indifferent to the Taliban. There wasn't any resistance, as we saw. And that's really hard for Western viewers to understand. They can't understand why the people wouldn't rise up and fight back against such an oppressive regime when women and girls' freedoms are at risk. Part of that misunderstanding is our projecting Western ideals onto a culture that isn't Western. For you and I, Taliban taking over our community would be like going from 1 to 10 on a scale of liberal to ultra-fundamentalist conservative. Not to mention it's a completely unfamiliar religion to most of us, so the entire thought of it is shocking. But the Afghan people are much more conservative than we are and are familiar with Islamic law. For some of them, it's more like going from a 7 to a 10. For others, though the government may not have forced ultra-conservatism on them, they chose it in their personal lives and welcome the change. This doesn't mean there aren't people fleeing. Thousands of people are attempting to get out as we speak, but the remaining 38 million are sticking around and aren't even putting up a fight. What we Americans view as liberation isn't always viewed the same way by others, and this is a very difficult thing for many of us to wrap our minds around. Americans believe our way of life is superior, and we often try to impose our thinking onto others. If people want change, they will find a way to implement it, and sometimes it's not always obvious. And there's also the possibility that people don't want change. And as squirmish as that makes us at times, we have to learn to accept it. It's important we remember this as we enter a new chapter with Afghanistan. A big question is, what will happen next? We are ending our military involvement, but is the war really over? Will we try to harm Afghanistan by refusing to recognize their new government and by imposing sanctions or embargoes? There's an intense reaction of wanting to liberate the women and girls of Afghanistan from oppression, but the most damaging thing we could do at this moment is impose economic strife on the people as they attempt to rebuild. What good have we made of a young girl's life if she not only is living under a fundamentalist government, but lacks access to quality food, medicine, and water? How much help are we towards a woman's right to work when an economically depressed nation struggles to find jobs even for the men? When nations economically thrive, they advance. And as advancements are made, nations become more free. It's often a painfully slow process, but it does happen. Nations need the freedom to evolve away from oppressive thinking in the same way we've been able to without outside interference. In these coming months, as we witness images from the news of Afghanistan that shock us, we must try to resist the urge to reinvade or debilitate them economically. We must truly end this war on all fronts, militarily and economically, and in doing that, we will finally be truly helping the women and girls of Afghanistan. Now, Alyssa, I want to ask you, what do you think the chances are that the U.S. actually does recognize the new government of Afghanistan, calling themselves the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, and actually opens up economic relations with them?
So it's a good question. The Chinese government already recognized the new Taliban-run government of Afghanistan, and Secretary Blinken was asked about it on the Sunday shows and basically said, if they met certain expectations within the international community. He didn't definitively say that we wouldn't, so I think that's an open question. But Kim, you make a lot of good points, and I would say this. The hard question, I think, on every American's mind, we've all lived through this war for the last 20 years, is, are things better now because we got in? And the answer is not an easy one. I don't want to by any means dismiss or minimize the advancements of women under, the U.S. role in Afghanistan over the last 20 years. I spoke about it the other day, maternal mortality and infant mortality going down by nearly half. 3 million women educated, a third of the population able to participate in voting. But to Kim's point, the fact that we are now pulling out and subjecting them, many of these younger women, I'm thinking of the women who are 20, 30 years old, who don't even remember a time before when the Taliban was in power. I worry that this is actually going to lead them to resent the West more, to resent the U.S.'s role because of this sort of whiplash of we were used to a certain quality of life and now we were abandoned and are subject to this Sharia rule. So I think it's an open question of what this means long term. I do think it's an incredibly dangerous moment for women in the country. I've spent time in Afghanistan. I could walk around in Kabul without wearing a head covering previously. You cannot be anywhere in the country without wearing the hijab, and that will be enforced by the Taliban and by military police. So there are certain immediate things that we're seeing, but there's a lot of long-term open questions. Ryan, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that you highlighted the fact that the Taliban isn't monolithic. The Taliban is a huge movement of Afghan people that has some completely wacko fundamentalists, and then some other people who have glommed onto the movement as they see it taking power in Afghanistan. And you also have people who looked back at what happened in the late 90s, early 2000s, and have said, if we go down that path again, it's going to end badly for us once again. So we need to moderate what our international image is. At the same time, there's a risk, I think, that you're going to pull in a lot of foreign people who are involved in, say, ISIS and other elements that are collapsing. Some of them have gone to Africa. These kind of globe-trotting jihadists who are looking for somewhere to go might say, oh, well, maybe Afghanistan is the place for us right now. And that as they come in, they could infuse it with more extremism, because extremism inside a movement has a tendency to win out over moderation, but it does appear like they're trying to present a moderate face at this point, so that they don't get nuked back into where they were 15 years ago. And I thought Kim's point on economic growth is a really interesting one. If you think back to Rosie the Riveter here in the United States, Rosie the Riveter was not hired because that factory owner got woke and decided that all of a sudden the gender equity on the factory floor was important. No, there was a full economy booming to produce what was needed for the war effort, and that pulled in racial and gender equity into the labor force. And so, in that sense, as if we help Afghanistan grow, we're actually helping to liberate some of its people, rather than sanctioning and bombing and drone striking it back into the Middle Ages. And we'll have more Rising for you right after this.